In the year 1778, Jacopo Belzoni, a barber of Padua, and Teresa, his wife, were rejoicing at the arrival of a son. They had christened him Giovanni Battista. His adventurous tale begins, strangely enough, in a monastery. The worthy Jacopo had fathered a brood of 14. Something had to be found for each and every one of them, and in the distribution, young Giovanni Battista was handed over to the church. He was to find a place in the world for himself as a monk. From the parental dwelling on a by street in Padua, the boy, still in his teens, walked the ancient highways of Umbria to the house of a monastic order in Rome. Somewhere in the old papal city behind an encircling wall, his days of boyhood and youth began before the dawn with the clang of a monastery bell and ended with the echoing cave of a darkened church and the solemn chanting of the offices. Years pass, years of quiet and withdrawal from the world. Of a sudden comes alarming news. The pot of the revolution has boiled over. The French are crossing the frontiers and invading Italy. Presently, there are disorders in Rome and a descent of French troops upon the city. The bells are silenced, the monasteries closed or seized for barracks, and the monks harried out into the street. Among the monks thus compelled to abandon the religious life was John Battista Belzoni. The Paduan novice had grown up into a giant, a colossus even, for he now stood 6 feet 7 inches in height. And not only did John Battista have a giant's strength, he had also the pride and the sense of decorum which accompany a giant's stature. Walking with a giant's disdain through the rabble of soldiers and revolutionists jeering by the monastery gate, the young monk passed forth into the world. The homeless young former monk was only 22 and may well have wondered what was now to become of him. At the monastery school he had chance to make a special study of the science of hydraulics, but that was hardly a knowledge to be peddled about in those uncertain times. Having no choice, he fell back on his physical strength and set about earning his living as a juggler and a Hercules of village fairs. From Italy, the showman monk made his way through Germany and then through Holland to the various kingdoms of the British Isles. Finding life pleasant in England, he settled down there and spent the Napoleonic years amusing his hosts and becoming something of an Englishman. For the next 10 years, his life is that of an Italian mountebank in England. The English knew the huge, serious, well-mannered foreigner as Signor Belzoni. They saw him in their pantomimes and at Bartholomew Fair. His favorite show was a spectacle called Samson, an edifying biblical affair in whose course Belzoni pulled down the pillars of a staged temple with the most blood-curdling roars, crash, dust, and general uproar. In England came romance. There John Battista found his Sarah. This resolute spouse was an Englishwoman of a stature almost as magnificent as her lord's, and with a character and a mind as British as the dome of St. Paul's. She called her husband Mr. B and accompanied him on his expeditions, never once losing her nerve or her practical grasp of life. The gigantic pair now set about the serious business of earning a living. After exhibiting Samson through Portugal and Spain, the Belzonis drifted to Malta, then a dependency of Egypt, and their Belzoni attracted the friendly attention of the governor. The adventurer's old interest in hydraulics was becoming practical. He had devised certain irrigating machines intended for agricultural use, and the governor advised him to go to Cairo and bring these contrivances to the attention of Mehmet Ali, the quasi-independent governor of Egypt. It is the month of August in the year 1815. The heat in Egypt is the heat of a dry oven. There is no sun in the cloudless sky, only an inundation of tremendous light whose source is no more to be looked at than a god. At a landing in Cairo, 3 Europeans are disembarking from a Nile boat. They are John Battista and Sarah Belzoni and James Curtain, their little Irish serving lad. The monk whom destiny had turned into a bohemian was now 37 years old, and the many influences he had undergone had molded an exceptional mind and character. On the one hand, he was a strolling mountebank. On the other, an educated man with church learning and a genuine respect for scholarship. He wrote English extraordinarily well, he could draw passably, and from his years as a stroller, he had gained a knack of getting along with men of all conditions and kinds. Negotiations with Mehmet Ali and the building and testing of Belzoni's water lifting will consume the greater part of a year. It was wasted time, for the Pasha decided, against the use of the device. The adventurer was rescued by his old friend, John Lewis Burckhardt, the traveller, who now persuaded the British Consul General, Henry Salt, to send Belzoni on a special expedition up the Nile. a colossal head of Memnon was lying in the sands at Thebes, and Salt wished to have it carried down the river and shipped off to the British Museum. It was anything but an easy task, for the giant head, or more properly the bust, measured some 6 by 8 feet and weighed over 7 tons. Belzoni handled it with homemade machinery. The engineer side of him was real. Other voyages followed. The first voyage saw the removal of the head and an exploring trip up the river to Abu Simbel and the cataracts. At Abu Simbel, greatest of rock temples, was clogged with a vast rabble of fallen stones and sand in which the colossi sat up to their necks. A second journey carried the explorer back to Thebes. The labyrinth of mountain tombs was still full of the ancient dead, some lying on the floors of their cave sepulchres, some standing, some on their heads all surfaced with a very fine and choking dust. On this second journey, the explorer began the clearing of Abu Simbel and discovered the tomb of Seti, the first in the Valley of the Kings, still the most beautifully decorated sepulchre in Egypt. Then followed expeditions to Philae, to the site of the Roman city of Berenice on the Red Sea, and a journey to the oasis of Elwar. The fever of exploration now descended on Mrs. B, and the intrepid lady, disguised as a man, went off by herself on a pilgrimage to Jerusalem, a feat of extraordinary fortitude and daring. At the close of his second journey, Belzoni had cleared and opened Abu Simbel, discovered the tomb of Seti I, and explored Philae, the Theban necropolis, and the Valley of the Kings. He had shown himself venturesome, courageous, and resolute. Returning to Cairo during the rainy season, Belzoni paused by night at the pyramids. So vividly were the stars of the Egyptian sky mirrored in the flood that there seemed to be two heavens awesome. Even a little terrible, the vast and ancient shapes of the pyramids rose seemingly from the starry water to the splendor overhead. He went to Giza and wandered about the 3 pyramids, studying and observing. From the sands of the Egyptian desert, the pyramids rise as masses of old stones suffused with a certain golden rust. The second great pyramid, the Pyramid of Hefron, had taken his eye, and rounded and about he went, now gazing up to the cap of reddish surfacing still in place about the peak, now pausing to study the huge confusion of sand and wreckage washed up about the base. Was there an opening, and if so, where? Or was the pyramid a solid hill of stone, as the Egyptians had told Herodotus 2,500 years before? The French scholars attached to Napoleon's expedition had sought an entrance in vain, and the Europeans resident in Cairo were meditating a scheme of collecting £20,000 at various European courts and forcing their way into the center of this pyramid by explosions. The entrance to the Great Pyramid being on the north, Belzoni studied with particular care the northern face of the second pyramid and presently discovered there 3 marks which seemed to offer a clue. Just under the center of the north face of the pyramid, the bordering wave of debris was high, as if it might possibly lie piled atop some entranceway. The accumulation of stone at the mound seemed less compact than the mass to either side, and the debris had apparently gathered since the removal of the surfacing. There was the place. There would he begin. Somewhat to his surprise, he got his permission to dig quite easily, the authorities merely insisting that he must not disturb ploughed ground. The capital on which he hoped to accomplish his undertaking consisted of a scant £200, some of it a gift, some of it a profit from the sale of antiquities. Early in February 1818, the adventurer left Cairo quietly and took up his quarters in a tent by the second pyramid. At the pyramid, all begins well. 80 natives have been secured, and Belzoni has put 40 to clearing the ground between the temple and the pyramid, and 40 more to clearing the debris at the rise by the northern rim. The natives began with a will, but for several days their labors promised no indication of success. It was particularly difficult work. The fringe of wreckage had become solidly jammed, and the only tools to be had were spades meant for the cutting of soft ground. There were times when it seemed as if the workmen could scarcely proceed. At the end of a fortnight's digging, the party working on the ground between the temple and the pyramid had cut through some 40 feet of rubbish to a broad pavement which seemed to encircle the pyramid, but the workmen at the north side had uncovered only deeper and deeper layers of debris. On the morning of February 18th, an overseer of the workmen came across the sand dunes with promising news. A workman of the northern party had perceived a small chink between 2 stones of the newly uncovered lower side of the pyramid. Belzoni returned with the messenger and found the workers gathered in a talkative group awaiting his coming. Yes, there was a small open slit between two of the great stones, into which the giant was able to thrust a palm stick to the length of 2 yards. The loose stone, torn from its place, revealed a mystery, a passage some 3 feet wide, choked with smaller stones and sand. Belzoni, in his turban and loose white Eastern dress, peered within. Trickles of sand fell noiselessly from the roof of the opening. They heard the drop of little stones. About them, the quiet of the desert seemed to have become intensified. On being excavated, this passage proved to be wider within, and after 5 days of clearing, the excavators arrived at an open tunnel leading inward. "Having made it wide enough," said Belzoni, "I took a candle in my hand and, looking in, perceived a spacious cavity. Bending its course to the center, it is evidently a forced passage executed by a powerful hand, and appears intended to find a way to the center of the pyramid. It was less a passage he had discovered than a wound. In ancient times, some ruler of the land had attempted to force the pyramid, but the deed and the man had perished from the memory of the world, and the pyramid itself had hidden the deep wound within its side. To make the entrance, huge stones of the outer casing had been cut and sawed. Then a ragged tunnel had been pierced directly into the heart of the masonry. It was an awesome place and exceedingly dangerous. Huge stones which the piercing of the tunnel had left hanging by a thread fell down, and every time that Belzoni crawled down its length of 100 feet, he never knew but what a cry and a muffled crash might announce. His living entombment in the dark of the edifice. Europeans from Cairo now got wind of the giant's enterprise and came riding over the sands to see Belzoni at his task. The discovery of the forced passage seems to have impressed them as an interesting failure, an attitude which struck at the giant's dignity and pride. The false passage ended in a pocket of fallen stone. He would abandon his exploration of it and continue his search for the real entrance. Staff in hand, the huge figure now resumed its trudge about the pyramid. The adventurer wandered over the ways to the Great Pyramid. It was then open, and somewhere in the hot heart of it, a typical European adventurer was working simply because the pyramids were his hobby. The name of this enthusiast was Caviglia, and he was the Italian master of a Mediterranean trading vessel flying the British flag. The good sailor had little education and needed little, for his work was primarily a matter of removing rubbish and discovering what lay beneath. Belzoni returned from his visit to his neighbor and countryman with a new notion in his head, prompted by certain indications he had been digging away. The rubbish gathered before the center of the northern face of the second pyramid, whilst the entrance into the Great Pyramid was not in line with the center of that edifice, but some 30 feet to the east of center, for the tomb chamber lay in the center, and the passage entered at the chamber's eastern end. He would abandon his excavation at the forced passage and begin again 30 feet to the east. He went to the spot and saw, or thought he saw, that the coating of rubbish was there, not so thickly piled. Moreover, it appeared sunken, as if an entrance below it might have fallen in. Again work began, for the natives had grown to appreciate the giant 6pence a day. On February 28th, a world of excitement and heart-quickening anticipation, something which looks like an entrance has been reached. For now appears a large granite stone set into the pyramid at the same angle as the passage into the Great Pyramid. On the day following, they have uncovered 3 great blocks of granite, one on each side and one on top, all lying in an inclined direction towards the center. It was the entrance at last. By the 2nd of March, the debris in front of the 3 stones having been cleared away, the long, sought opening was seen. It proved to be a passage 4 feet high and 3 feet 6 inches wide, which descended at a steep incline into the pyramid. Its granite walls were undisturbed, but the passage itself was full of wreckage which had slid down the incline and piled up to form a barrier. Provided with torches and candles, Belzoni and a few workmen now followed the passage for 104 feet down into the dark. The giant bulk of Belzoni nearly filled up the passage as he came crouching almost double and holding a dripping candlelight. Suddenly, to their great dismay, the passage came to a blind end at 3 solid granite walls. Discouragement fell upon them as heavy as a pyramid. Suddenly a discovery, a catch of the breath. The stone at the end of the passage is not fixed solidly in place. It is a portcullis which can be raised. The barrier stone is already 8 inches above the true floor and rests on surface rubbish. There followed a hurrying back and forth through the passage, a coming of workmen with levers, and a time of hard work in the tiny cubicle of the pyramid. When the aperture had grown wide enough for a man to pass through, a native squirmed under carrying a candle and returned saying that the place within was very fine. It had chanced that on the day before, a fellow countryman of Belzoni's, the Chevalier Frediani, had come to visit Giza. He had proved a pleasant guest, and the Belzoni had invited him to remain for the opening of the pyramid. This second Italian now joined the little group, lifting the portcullis. It was now high enough for Belzoni to crawl under, and he did so, followed by the Chevalier. Over 1,000 years, perhaps more, had passed since the tunnels into which they crawled had echoed to the sound of human voices. The huge shadow of Belzoni followed along the walls. The granite twinkled in the first light of 10 long centuries. At the end of the passage was an open pit, which they descended along a rope, and at the depth of the pit were passages thick with dark and silence. Belzoni went off on one trail, Frediani on another. Presently the giant arrived at the door of the chamber of the tomb. He heard a sound of footsteps, and Frediani entered with his candles. But the treasure of the pyramid, the sarcophagus of Khafra, king of Egypt, was cut in the floor. The lid was awry, and the stone coffin full of a great quantity of earth and stones. Who had violated it in the long course of history's 4,000 years? No one knows. There is evidence that the Caliph al-Mamun had forced the pyramid, but there is no evidence that he found the mummy in its place. There are old Arabic tales of kings encased in figures of gold, with magical golden snakes on their crowns, which spread their hoods in anger, hissed and struck at the intruders. All is legend and myth. The forced tunnel, however, had certainly once entered the original passages, but later on, the violated masonry had fallen in and barred the way. Europe of the Dark Ages had never known of the attempt. The East had forgotten. There were Arabic inscriptions on the walls written with charcoal, but the characters were nearly imperceptible and rubbed off into dust at the slightest touch. Green, pleasant England again, the white cliffs of Dover, and the autumn fog drifting down on London and the ships. Belzoni's fame had gone before him to the capitals. His popular title of senior, which both Italianized him and linked him with his mountebank past, now fell into disuse, and it was as Mr. Belzoni that he faced a new life of dignity and prestige. Winter found the travelled and his Sarah living happily in London lodgings, visited and consulted by the learned and the great. Belzoni kept his head. With his usual common sense, he was busily at work arranging an exhibition. All London came to the hall on Piccadilly when the doors opened in the spring of 1821. Belzoni had reproduced 2 of the principal chambers in the tomb of Seti I, painting, sculptures and all, and displayed idols, coins, mummies, scarabs, articles of dress and adornment, lacrimatories, and a splendid mass of papyrus. The tomb of Seti was lit within by lamps and made a tremendous impression. Now and then the giant moved towering through the throng, and mothers would bid their little flaxen-haired boys and girls to look at the man who had opened the pyramid. A season in Paris followed the year in London, and then came the last great adventure. The fever of exploring woke again within his veins, and he determined to cross the great African desert and make his way to the almost fabulous city of Timbuktu. He would land in Morocco, go south through the Moroccan possessions, and then join a caravan bound for the faithful city. The plan seemed practical enough, and on an autumn morning in 1822, the roving Titan bade farewell to his faithful Amazon and followed his boxes and baggage aboard a vessel for Gibraltar. In Fez, the Moroccan capital, they seemed to have played with him for a while, for the emperor first gave him a permission to go through the country, and then withdrew consent. Much chagrined, the explorer now returned to Gibraltar, and there determined on a course which did honor to his courage and perseverance. The way south to Timbuktu being barred, he would make his way along the African coast to the city of Great Benin, and then struggle northward to his goal. It was a route to daunt any explorer, for it led into one of the darkest and most dangerous areas of unknown Africa. Sailing in trading ships and little vessels of one sort or another, the adventurer slowly made his way south along the West African shore to the English station of Cape Castle on the Guinea coast. There Sir Richard Menz, commanding the British naval squadron on the African west coast, befriended him and sent him to Benin in His Majesty's brig Swinger. On the 20th of October 1823, the brig arrived off the bar of Benin River. The brig Providence was lying off and Belzoni boarded her at the invitation of her master, Captain John Hodgson. A month later, a launch belonging to the ship is lowered overside. It contained Hodgson and Belzoni. A few days later, word comes to the sailors that the guest whom they had so cherished, loved, even as a shipmate, is lying ill at Benin. They hurry him down the river to Guado, hoping to get him to the coast and the sea air. But the end is at hand, an end calmly envisaged, the last of his strength he spends trying to write a letter to his wife. He entrusts Hodgson with a ring for her and a message full of the most touching affection, then yields the ghost. They buried him at Guado under a great tree, and there he lies in the heart of Africa. So ends the tale of the monk who passed from the peace of a monastery to an acrobat stage in a village square. The young Italian had accepted his destiny calmly and made the best of it, yet never bowed his head. Archaeologist Howard Carter best summarized the convoluted life of Giovanni Battista Belzoni in a single sentence. "He was one of the most remarkable men in the whole history of Egyptology," said the man who opened the tomb of King Tutankhamun.